The handcuffs bit into Maria Vasquez's wrists as Officer Scott Miller shoved her against the patrol car at the Interstate 87 checkpoint. His voice dripped with contempt as he called her just another illegal trying to smuggle drugs through Riverdale. The 34-year-old auto mechanic had been pulled over for suspicious behavior driving an old pickup truck while Hispanic, and now faced charges that could destroy the quiet life she'd built after leaving her past behind. But when Detective Rebecca Shaw rolled up Maria's sleeves during booking and saw the intricate military tattoos covering both arms' unit insignias from classified operations coordinates from battlefields that didn't officially exist, and memorial ink for fallen soldiers whose names were redacted from history books, the entire police station fell silent. They had just arrested a decorated Army intelligence officer whose service record was so classified that her very existence had been erased from public knowledge. Maria's mind flashed back to a dusty compound in Afghanistan, the acrid smell of gunpowder, blood on her hands as she applied pressure to a wound. A whispered order, "If you're captured, remember Protocol Delta 7. You don't exist." She blinked away the memory and focused on the present danger. 20 minutes earlier, Maria had been driving through Riverdale County on her way home from delivering auto parts to a customer in the next county. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the highway as she navigated her weathered Ford pickup through the winding roads that led back to her small apartment above the Vasquez family auto shop. The truck's radio crackled with static, tuned to a Spanish-language station that reminded her of her childhood in Arizona, when life had been simpler, and her biggest worry was whether she'd finish her homework before her mother called her for dinner. She hummed along to a familiar ranchera, her calloused fingers tapping the steering wheel in rhythm. Maria wore faded jeans and a gray work shirt with Vasquez Auto embroidered on the chest pocket. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail and a thin silver chain. Her only jewelry disappeared beneath her collar. Nothing about her appearance suggested anything more remarkable than a hard-working mechanic heading home after a long day. Only the careful way she scanned her surroundings, a habit so ingrained she no longer noticed doing it, hinted at training beyond civilian life. Her eyes continuously checked mirrors, noted vehicles that stayed behind her for more than 2 turns, catalogued potential cover positions along the roadside. Old habits from another life. The checkpoint appeared around a bend, like a concrete and steel spiderweb stretched across the interstate. Orange cones channeled traffic into single lanes, while uniformed officers directed vehicles toward inspection areas with the mechanical precision of people who'd performed the same routine thousands of times. Maria's hands instinctively tightened on the steering wheel. Her heartbeat quickened, but her breathing remained steady, controlled through techniques learned during specialized training. She'd passed through checkpoints before without incident. This would be no different. "Standard procedure," she whispered to herself. "Stay calm. You're just Maria, the mechanic." But somewhere deep in her mind, a voice whispered, "Today is the day they find you." The wait stretched on for nearly 40 minutes. Maria watched as cars ahead of her received cursory inspections, a quick glance at driver's licenses, a few routine questions, a wave toward the exit ramp. The officers seemed to move with purpose, but without the aggressive tension that characterized checkpoints in war zones. This was routine bureaucracy, not combat readiness. She allowed herself to relax slightly, thinking about the transmission she needed to rebuild. When she got back to the shop, the evening shift she was covering for her sister Lucia, and the quiet satisfaction of honest work that asked nothing more than competence and reliability. In her rearview mirror, she noted the K9 unit working its way through vehicles several cars back. The handler was professional, keeping the German Shepherd focused on its task rather than using the animal to intimidate. Still, Maria's mind automatically calculated how she would respond if the dog alerted on her vehicle. Old operational planning unnecessary now, but impossible to switch off completely. A flash of memory, a border crossing in Pakistan, false documents hidden in her boot, the weight of a compact pistol pressed against her lower back. The stakes, then, were life and death. Today, they were simple inconvenience. Or so she thought. When her turn came, Officer Scott Miller approached with the swagger of someone who enjoyed the authority his uniform provided. He was younger than Maria by several years, with a kind of confidence that came from never having to question whether his presence was welcome or threatening. His partner, Officer Tyler Green, hung back near the patrol car, writing notes on a clipboard with the careful attention of someone still learning the job. "License and registration," Miller commanded, his tone suggesting he'd already decided this interaction would be more complicated than necessary. Maria handed over her documents without comment, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. The license showed her real name, her Riverdale address, and a photo that captured her on one of her better days, hair pulled back neatly. Expression serious but not hostile, the kind of official photograph that revealed nothing about the person behind it. Miller studied the license longer than necessary, comparing the photo to her face with theatrical attention to detail. "Maria Vasquez," he read aloud, pronouncing each syllable with exaggerated care. "What kind of work brings you through our checkpoint today, Miss Vasquez?" "Auto mechanic," she replied simply. "Delivering parts to a customer." Maria immediately recognized the technique, the slight emphasis on her name, the unnecessary question about her occupation that was clearly stated on her license, the subtle assertion of dominance in his tone. It was interrogation 101, a tactic she had been both trained to use and to resist. "Auto mechanic," Miller repeated, his tone suggesting skepticism. "That's interesting work for a lady. You any good at it?" Maria recognized the trap in the question. Any answer would be wrong. Confidence would be seen as arrogance. Humility would be seen as deception. She settled for the truth. "I do my job." Miller walked slowly around her truck, his boots echoing against the asphalt, as he examined the vehicle with the attention of someone looking for justification rather than evidence. The Ford was old, but well-maintained, its body showing the honest wear of daily use without the deterioration that came from neglect. Tools rattled softly in the bed, secured by bungee cords and organized with the precision of someone who understood that efficiency could mean the difference between profit and loss. "Pretty nice setup for someone who fixes cars," Miller observed, running his hand along the truck's tailgate. "Must be good money in the mechanic business these days." Maria said nothing. She'd learned that explanations usually made situations worse with people who'd already decided you were guilty of something. Miller seemed to interpret her silence as confirmation of whatever suspicions he'd been nurturing. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his voice hardening with authority. "We're going to need to take a closer look." Maria complied, moving with the careful control of someone who understood that any sudden motion could be interpreted as resistance. She stood beside her truck while Miller and Green began a systematic search of the interior, pulling out floor mats and checking under seats with the thoroughness of people who expected to find something significant. As Miller searched her vehicle, Maria quietly assessed her situation. 3 patrol cars, 6 officers visible, 2 K9 units. The checkpoint was positioned where the highway narrowed with concrete barriers preventing vehicles from turning around. Standard tactical positioning. Her gaze shifted to the officers themselves, their equipment, their positions, their levels of alertness. Miller was arrogant, but trained. Green was inexperienced, but observant. The K9 handlers were professionals. She catalogued potential threats and escape routes purely out of habit, knowing she wouldn't need either. Those days were behind her. Detective Rebecca Shaw arrived during the search, her presence adding a layer of seniority to the proceedings that immediately changed the dynamic. She was older than both officers, with the tired eyes of someone who'd seen enough real crimes to recognize the difference between genuine threats and bureaucratic theater. Her uniform was pressed but comfortable worn, with the easy authority of experience rather than the rigid precision of insecurity. "What do we have here?" Shaw asked, her tone professional but not hostile. "Suspicious vehicle." Miller replied, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who believed he'd discovered something important. "Driver's been evasive. Vehicle doesn't match her stated profession, and she's got tools that could be used for breaking and entering." Shaw examined Maria's documents with the quick efficiency of someone who'd processed thousands of similar interactions. Her eyes moved between the license photo and Maria's face, then toward the truck with its organized collection of automotive tools. "Auto mechanic," Shaw read from the license. "How long have you been in the business?" "Miss Vasquez." "5 years," Maria replied. "I work at my family shop in Riverdale. Vasquez Family Auto." Shaw nodded, apparently familiar with the establishment. "I know the place. Your uncle owns it." "My uncle. I help run it now." Something in Shaw's expression shifted, a subtle recognition that suggested she understood the difference between suspicious behavior and racial profiling. She watched as Miller continued his search with increasing frustration, finding nothing more incriminating than a collection of automotive tools and a lunch bag containing the remnants of a sandwich. "Find anything?" Shaw asked after Miller had exhausted the truck's interior. "Nothing yet." Miller admitted, his tone suggesting this was a temporary setback rather than evidence of Maria's innocence. "But I've got a feeling about this one. Something's not right." Shaw studied Maria with the analytical attention of someone trained to read people rather than simply process them. She noticed the way Maria stood, relaxed but alert, compliant but not submissive. There was something in her posture that suggested familiarity with authority, without fear of it, the bearing of someone who had dealt with military hierarchies and understood the difference between respect and intimidation. "Any reason you're driving through Riverdale County this afternoon?" Shaw asked. "I deliver parts to customers throughout the county," Maria explained. "Today was a transmission rebuild kit for a garage in Lakeside." "You have documentation for that delivery?" Maria reached slowly into her truck's glove compartment and retrieved a work order with the customer's signature and timestamp. Shaw examined it with professional attention, noting the legitimate business information and the detailed description of automotive parts that would be difficult to fabricate on short notice. Miller, however, remained convinced that his instincts were correct. "I still think we should bring her in for questioning," he insisted. "Something about this whole situation doesn't add up." Shaw looked at the work order, then at Maria, then at the perfectly ordinary truck filled with perfectly ordinary tools. She seemed to be weighing the difference between following proper procedure and avoiding unnecessary harassment. Unfortunately for Maria, procedure won. "We're going to need you to come with us for additional questioning," Shaw announced, her tone apologetic but firm. "Standard procedure when there are questions about documentation." Maria felt the familiar weight of inevitability settling around her shoulders. She'd been through enough encounters with authority to recognize when protest would only make things worse. Sometimes cooperation was the fastest path through bureaucratic obstruction, even when that cooperation felt like surrender. "Am I under arrest?" she asked quietly. "Detained for questioning," Shaw corrected, though the distinction seemed more legal than practical when Miller produced handcuffs with obvious satisfaction. As the metal closed around her wrists, Maria closed her eyes and tried not to think about the last time she'd been restrained against her will. That had been in Afghanistan, in a compound that officially didn't exist during an operation that was never supposed to happen. The memories tried to surface sand and smoke, and the weight of decisions that had changed everything. The sensation of zip ties cutting into her skin as she was dragged across a dirt floor. The sharp crack of a rifle butt against her temple. The taste of blood in her mouth. But she pushed them down with the practiced discipline of someone who'd learned to compartmentalize trauma. Now was not the time to revisit those shadows. The drive to Riverdale Police Station took 12 minutes through streets that Maria had grown to know well during her years of quiet anonymity. The township was small enough that everyone eventually became familiar, the kind of place where neighbors noticed when something was different, but usually minded their own business. She wondered if anyone would notice her absence from the auto shop, if Lucia would worry when she didn't return on schedule, if her carefully constructed normal life was about to unravel because Officer Scott Miller had decided she looked suspicious while Hispanic. Through the patrol car window, Maria watched ordinary people going about their ordinary lives. A mother pushing a stroller, teenagers on skateboards, an elderly couple holding hands on a park bench. The mundane piece of civilian existence that she'd fought to protect, then fought to rejoin. Whatever happened next, she knew one thing with certainty. Her carefully constructed anonymity was about to end. The police station occupied a modern building that tried to project authority without intimidation, lots of glass and steel, clean lines, and the kind of architectural optimism that suggested faith in the system it housed. Maria had driven past it hundreds of times without ever imagining she'd see the inside as anything other than a law-abiding citizen reporting a crime or seeking help. The booking process began with routine questions and administrative details that revealed nothing about the storm gathering around Maria's carefully hidden past. Name, address, employment, emergency contact information, the mundane details of a life that appeared straightforward and unremarkable. Detective Shaw handled the paperwork with professional efficiency while Miller hovered nearby, clearly hoping that deeper investigation would vindicate his suspicions. "We'll need you to remove any jewelry and empty your pockets," Shaw instructed, following standard protocol that had nothing to do with Maria specifically, and everything to do with institutional procedures designed to process human beings like inventory. Maria complied, placing her watch, a simple chain necklace, and the contents of her pockets onto the processing counter. Nothing remarkable: keys, wallet, a few dollars in cash, and a small notebook where she kept track of work schedules and appointments. The kind of personal effects that belonged to someone who lived a quiet, responsible life, without hidden complexities. "Roll up your sleeves." Shaw continued, preparing to document any identifying marks or tattoos as part of the standard booking process. It was routine procedure, performed thousands of times on thousands of people, usually revealing nothing more significant than poorly thought-out decisions made during college or military service. Maria hesitated for just a moment, long enough for Shaw to notice, but not long enough to seem like resistance. She knew what was about to happen, had known from the moment the handcuffs clicked shut that her carefully maintained anonymity was about to end. Some secrets were too big to hide forever, and the artwork covering her arms told a story that couldn't be explained away as youthful indiscretion. She rolled up her left sleeve first, revealing ink that covered her forearm from wrist to elbow in intricate detail. The tattoos weren't the amateur work of a street artist or the impulsive decoration of a weekend warrior. They were military precision, professional quality, and told a story that made Detective Shaw's breath catch in her throat. The centerpiece was a unit insignia that Shaw recognized from intelligence briefings, a stylized eagle clutching both an olive branch and arrows surrounded by text that was partially obscured but clearly military. Below it, Coordinates were tattooed in precise numbers that corresponded to locations Shaw couldn't identify but instinctively knew weren't meant for civilian knowledge. Memorial tattoos ran along the edge of her forearm, names and dates that suggested friends lost in combat, rendered in script, so precise it looked like official documentation. When Maria rolled up her right sleeve, the story became even more complex. This arm displayed a different unit insignia, one that Shaw didn't recognize, but that carried the same weight of official authority. More coordinates, more memorial ink, and woven throughout it all, symbols that suggested specialized training and classified operations. The booking room fell completely silent as Shaw processed what she was seeing. Miller stopped his restless movement and stared at Maria's arms as if trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly become far more complicated than he'd expected. Even the desk sergeant, who had been processing paperwork with the mechanical attention of routine, looked up and focused on the woman who'd been brought in for suspicious behavior. "Ma'am," Shaw said quietly, her voice carrying a new level of respect that hadn't been present during the checkpoint encounter. "I'm going to need to make some phone calls." Captain Mark Daniels received the call while reviewing budget reports in his office, the kind of administrative work that occupied most of his days since Riverdale County had become more concerned with community policing than serious crime. When Detective Shaw's voice came through the secure line, her tone carried an urgency that made him set aside his calculator and focus completely on her words. "Sir, we have a situation that requires immediate attention. The woman we brought in from the checkpoint has military tattoos that suggest classified service. I need authorization to contact Federal Liaison." Daniels had been commanding the Riverdale Police Station for 8 years, long enough to recognize when routine procedure was about to become a bureaucratic nightmare. Military personnel, especially those with classified backgrounds, represented the kind of jurisdictional complexity that could transform a simple detention into an interagency incident with career-ending potential. "What kind of military tattoos?" he asked, already reaching for the emergency contact directory that contained numbers he'd hoped never to use. "Unit insignias I don't recognize, coordinates that look like operational locations, and memorial ink that suggests combat deployment. This isn't weekend warrior material, Captain. This woman has been places that don't appear on maps." In the booking room, Maria sat in a plastic chair with her sleeves still rolled up, watching as various personnel found excuses to walk past and steal glances at her arms. She'd experienced this before, the moment when her carefully hidden military background surfaced and transformed her from ordinary citizen into classified puzzle. The attention was unwelcome, but predictable, like reopening a wound that had never properly healed. Officer Tyler Green entered the room carrying a digital camera, his movements betraying the nervous energy of someone who'd never encountered anything more serious than traffic violations. He was fresh from the police academy and still learning to navigate situations that fell outside standard training protocols. "Ma'am, I need to photograph your tattoos for documentation purposes," he announced, his voice cracking slightly on the word documentation. The camera trembled in his hands as he raised it toward Maria's exposed arms, clearly understanding that he was recording evidence of something significant without comprehending what that something might be. Maria extended her arms without comment, allowing him to capture detailed images of the artwork that had cost her 3 years of pain and thousands of dollars to complete. Each tattoo represented a chapter of her life that officially didn't exist, deployments to countries that denied American presence, operations that were classified above the level of elected officials, and friends whose deaths couldn't be acknowledged because their missions couldn't be admitted. The left arm told the story of her first deployment with the 318th Intelligence Battalion, a unit that specialized in deep cover reconnaissance in hostile territory. The eagle insignia was surrounded by smaller symbols representing specialized training language, school psychological operations, advanced combat tactics. Below it, coordinates marked the location of a forward operating base in Afghanistan, where she'd spent 8 months gathering intelligence on enemy supply routes. Her right arm documented the darker chapters. The insignia belonged to Joint Task Force Phantom, a multi-service unit that conducted operations so classified that its members were required to sign death agreements, legal documents, stating that if they were captured or killed, the government would deny their existence rather than risk exposing operational details. The memorial tattoos honored teammates who died in places that weren't supposed to contain American forces fighting enemies that officially didn't exist. Green's hands shook as he documented each symbol, each coordinate, each name. This wasn't the mundane documentation of gang tattoos or prison ink. This was evidence of a world he hadn't known existed outside of movies and video games. The woman sitting calmly before him, whom Miller had detained for driving while Hispanic, had operated in shadows so deep that most military personnel would never know they existed. "You were in Afghanistan?" he asked, unable to contain his curiosity as he photographed a particular set of coordinates. Maria studied him for a moment, assessing his intentions, then nodded once. "Among other places. My cousin served there, 82nd Airborne, 2012. "Good unit," Maria replied, her voice neutral but not unfriendly. "They saved our asses more than once." Green looked like he wanted to ask more questions, but the door opened and Detective Shaw returned with Captain Daniels and a woman Maria didn't recognize. The newcomer wore civilian clothes, but her bearing screamed military, back-straight eyes scanning the room with tactical precision, hands positioned for quick response if needed. "Miss Vasquez, I'm Captain Daniels," the older man introduced himself. "This is Captain Rachel Torres, our military liaison officer. We need to ask you some questions about your service record." Torres stepped forward, her gaze fixed on Maria's tattoos with the focused intensity of recognition. "Ma'am, I need to verify your military status. Name, rank, and service number, please." Maria met her eyes with the steady gaze of someone who'd answered difficult questions before. "Maria Elena Vasquez, Staff Sergeant, United States Army Service Number 57832, 1994. Unit assignments: I served 8 years, active duty Army intelligence, discharged 3 years ago with honors. Unit assignments." Maria paused, her voice shifting to something harder, more formal. "That information is classified above your clearance level, Captain." The response was delivered without arrogance or hostility, simply a statement of fact that revealed more about Maria's background than any detailed explanation could have provided. Soldiers with standard military experience didn't speak in terms of classification levels. They didn't automatically assume that their service records were restricted information. The casual reference to clearance levels suggested familiarity with intelligence hierarchies that existed far above normal military command structures. Torres understood the implications immediately. She'd spent enough time in military intelligence circles to recognize when she was dealing with someone whose service record was compartmentalized at levels that required special authorization to access. The woman sitting calmly in the booking room wasn't just a veteran. She was a veteran whose very existence had been classified as a matter of national security. "I'm going to need to make some calls," Torres announced, her tone indicating that those calls would reach far beyond local law enforcement channels. Captain Daniels returned to the booking room 30 minutes later, accompanied by a federal agent whose presence transformed the space into something resembling a crime scene. Agent Christopher Wong carried credentials from an agency whose name was printed in letters too small to read clearly, the kind of bureaucratic obscurity that suggested his actual authority exceeded his apparent rank. Wong examined Maria's tattoos with the clinical attention of someone trained to extract intelligence from visual evidence. He photographed individual symbols with professional equipment, made notes in a notebook filled with shorthand that looked like code, and asked questions that revealed intimate knowledge of military intelligence operations. "How long were you with JTF Phantom?" Wong asked casually, as if the question were routine rather than an inquiry into operations that were classified above the level of most generals. 14 months, Maria replied evenly. Operation Desert Ghost, Operation Sandstorm, and 2 assignments that don't have official designations. Wong nodded, making additional notes that suggested Maria's answers were consistent with information contained in files that weren't supposed to exist. The conversation continued with the comfortable rhythm of professionals who understood they were discussing matters that couldn't be acknowledged in official reports. "Your discharge was voluntary. Technically," Wong said, the pause suggesting deeper knowledge of circumstances. Maria was quiet for a long moment, her eyes focusing on something beyond the walls of the booking room. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of decisions that had cost her everything she'd worked to achieve. "Meaning I chose resignation over court-martial when Operation Nightfall went sideways and someone needed to take responsibility for decisions that were made above my pay grade." Wong stopped writing and looked directly at Maria for the first time since entering the room. Operation Nightfall wasn't just classified. It was the kind of mission that existed only in files so secret that acknowledging their existence could destabilize international relationships. For Maria to reference it so casually meant either she was exactly who she appeared to be, or she had access to intelligence that made her far more dangerous than any ordinary criminal. "You took responsibility for operational failures that weren't your fault." "Someone had to," Maria said, her voice flat. "Politicians don't like admitting that they authorize operations that officially don't happen. When those operations fail, they need someone to blame who can't defend themselves publicly." The booking room fell silent, as everyone present processed the implications of what they'd just heard. Maria hadn't just served in classified units, she'd been scapegoated for political reasons, her career destroyed to protect officials whose names couldn't be connected to failed missions. Detective Shaw was the first to speak, her voice carrying a new level of understanding about the woman they'd arrested for driving while Hispanic. "Ma'am, why didn't you say anything about your military service at the checkpoint?" Maria looked at her with eyes that held 3 years of carefully maintained invisibility. "Because I've spent the last 3 years learning to be nobody special. Drawing attention to my background defeats the purpose of disappearing." Officer Miller, who had been conspicuously quiet since the tattoos were revealed, finally found his voice. "We had no way of knowing you were military." "You had no reason to assume I wasn't," Maria replied quietly. "The only thing you knew about me was that I was Hispanic and driving an old truck. Everything else was assumption." The observation landed with uncomfortable accuracy. Miller had indeed made assumptions based on appearance, rather than evidence, transforming routine traffic enforcement into racial profiling. The discovery of Maria's military background didn't change the fact that she'd been targeted for harassment based on ethnicity rather than behavior. Agent Wong closed his notebook and exchanged glances with Captain Daniels that suggested the conversation had moved beyond local law enforcement jurisdiction. "Miss Vasquez, I'm going to need to contact my superiors before we can proceed. This situation involves federal interests that require authorization above my level." Maria nodded, unsurprised by the development. Her military service had involved so many classified operations that even routine background checks required special clearance. The fact that she'd been arrested at all meant that someone would have to make decisions about how much of her background could be acknowledged without compromising ongoing operations or revealing information that was supposed to remain buried. "How long will that take?" Detective Shaw asked. Could be hours, could be days, Wong replied honestly. Depends on how many people need to sign off on releasing classified information for a local law enforcement matter. The booking room settled into an uncomfortable waiting period as various officials made phone calls and filed reports that would eventually reach decision-makers with enough authority to determine how the situation should be resolved. Maria remained seated in her plastic chair, rolling her sleeves back down now that the documentation was complete, returning to the appearance of ordinary citizen rather than classified asset. But the transformation was incomplete. Everyone who'd seen her tattoos now looked at her differently, understanding that they were in the presence of someone whose experiences exceeded anything in their own backgrounds. The quiet auto mechanic had become a puzzle that challenged their assumptions about heroism service and the price of protecting secrets that civilians weren't supposed to know existed. Miller approached Maria during the wait, his manner subdued. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I apologize for my attitude earlier." Maria studied him for a moment, then nodded once. "You were doing your job as you understood it. The problem isn't individual officers, it's systems that encourage assumptions based on appearance rather than evidence." The young officer looked like he wanted to say more but settled for a respectful nod before walking away. His understanding of the world had been shaken not just by Maria's classified background, but by her recognition that his actions stemmed from institutional problems rather than personal malice. Captain Torres approached next, her manner respectful rather than investigative. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, what made you choose auto mechanics after intelligence work?" Maria considered the question, weighing how much truth she could share without revealing information that remained classified. "After spending years in places where nothing was what it seemed, I wanted work where problems had clear solutions. Cars don't lie. When something's broken, you can fix it. When it works, it works. There's no ambiguity, no hidden agendas, no politics." "Do you miss it, the military?" "I miss the certainty of knowing I was serving something larger than myself," Maria said carefully. "I miss working with people who understood that some things are worth dying for. But I don't miss the politics that turned service into liability and heroism into scapegoating." Torres nodded understanding more than she could acknowledge officially. Military intelligence attracted people who were willing to sacrifice everything for ideals that politicians often abandoned when expedience demanded different priorities. The best intelligence officers were frequently the ones who paid the highest price for their dedication to principles that existed above personal interest. As the afternoon stretched into evening, Maria found herself in a limbo that was both familiar and unsettling, waiting for bureaucratic machinery to process decisions that would affect her future while remaining powerless to influence the outcome. She'd been in similar positions before during debriefings after classified operations and during the investigation that had ended her military career. The first return call came 3 hours later, bringing news that surprised no one familiar with federal bureaucracy. Maria's case had been referred to multiple agencies, each of which claimed jurisdictional interest in different aspects of her background. The Department of Defense wanted to review her service record. Homeland Security was concerned about classified information, and various intelligence agencies were conducting their own assessments of security implications. Agent Wong returned to the booking room with updated instructions that revealed nothing about resolution and everything about bureaucratic complexity. "Miss Vasquez, you're going to remain in federal custody pending completion of security reviews. This isn't criminal detention, it's administrative hold while various agencies determine how to proceed." Maria accepted the news with the resignation of someone who'd learned that federal bureaucracy operated according to its own logic, often independent of justice or common sense. She'd expected that her arrest would trigger security reviews that could take weeks to complete, especially given the sensitive nature of her background and the political implications of acknowledging operations that officially didn't exist. "Will I be able to contact my family?" she asked. "Limited contact supervised by federal agents," Wong replied. "Your sister will be informed that you're safe, but unable to return home immediately due to federal matters. She won't be given details about the nature of those matters." The booking room began to empty as local law enforcement personnel realized their role in the situation was concluding. Federal custody meant federal responsibility transferring Maria from Riverdale County's jurisdiction to agencies with resources and authority that exceeded anything available at the local level. Detective Shaw was the last to leave, pausing at the door to offer something approaching an apology. "Ms. Vasquez, I want you to know that what happened at the checkpoint doesn't represent how we normally operate." Maria met her eyes with understanding rather than anger. "Detective, you did your job according to the information you had. The problem isn't with individual officers, it's with systems that encourage assumptions based on appearance rather than evidence." As the booking room door closed behind Shaw, Maria found herself alone with Agent Wong and the weight of a past that refused to remain buried. Outside Riverdale County continued its normal evening routine, unaware that one of its quiet residents had just reminded everyone that heroism often hides in plain sight, disguised as ordinary people living extraordinary lives of carefully maintained anonymity. The federal holding facility in downtown Riverdale occupied a nondescript office building that most residents passed without realizing it housed temporary detention cells for cases involving national security. Maria's cell was more like a hotel room than a jail, clean bedding, private bathroom television with basic cable and a small desk where she could write or read. The accommodations reflected her status as administrative detainee rather than criminal suspect, though the locked door made the distinction academic. As she sat on the edge of the bed alone for the first time since her arrest, Maria allowed herself a moment of genuine emotion. She closed her eyes and took 3 deep breaths, using the meditation techniques she'd learned during her specialized training. 3 years, she whispered to the empty room. 3 years of careful anonymity gone in an afternoon. She'd known this day might come, had even prepared for it in small ways. There was emergency cash hidden in her apartment, a go-bag with essentials stored in a locker at the bus station, contacts who could help her disappear again if necessary. But as she looked around the comfortable detention cell, Maria realized she didn't want to run. She was tired of hiding, tired of pretending to be less than she was tired of carrying secrets alone. Whatever happened next, whether federal agencies decided she was a security risk or determined she could return to civilian life, at least the weight of complete anonymity would be lifted. For the first time in 3 years, someone knew who she really was. Not just Maria Vasquez, auto mechanic, but Staff Sergeant Vasquez, intelligence specialist, survivor of Operation Nightfall, bearer of classified knowledge that still kept Pentagon officials awake at night. She rolled up her sleeve and traced the memorial tattoo that honored her fallen teammates' names that didn't appear in official records, dates that didn't match any publicly acknowledged operations locations, that weren't marked on any civilian map. These were her true family, the people who had understood her completely, who had shared experiences that couldn't be explained to outsiders. For their sake, she would face whatever came next with the same courage she'd shown on battlefields that didn't officially exist. Maria Vasquez lay back on the bed, closed her eyes, and waited for the machinery of national security to determine her fate. Dr. Hannah Mitchell arrived on the second morning carrying a briefcase filled with psychological evaluation materials and authorization papers that granted her access to classified information. She was a military psychologist who specialized in treating veterans with classified service backgrounds, one of the few mental health professionals cleared to discuss operations that officially didn't exist. "Miss Vasquez, I'm Dr. Mitchell. I've been asked to conduct a Taquitours psychological evaluation as part of your security review." Her voice carried the professional warmth of someone trained to put people at ease, while extracting information that might be difficult to share. Maria looked up from the newspaper she'd been reading, noting the careful way Dr. Mitchell introduced herself without mentioning which agency had requested the evaluation. "Standard procedure for anyone who surfaces after classified service." "Something like that," Mitchell confirmed, settling into the room's single chair with the comfortable efficiency of someone who'd conducted similar evaluations before. "I understand you served with some very specialized units. That kind of service can leave psychological impacts that affect how people adjust to civilian life." The evaluation began with routine questions about mental health, family history, and general well-being, the kind of standardized assessment that could apply to any veteran transitioning from military to civilian life. Mitchell asked about sleep patterns, anxiety levels, relationships with family and friends, and general satisfaction with post-military employment. Maria answered honestly but cautiously, understanding that her responses would be analyzed for signs of psychological instability that might affect her security clearance or suggest she posed a risk to classified information. The questions seemed harmless, but she'd learned during her intelligence training that the most dangerous inquiries often appeared routine. "Tell me about your decision to leave the military." Mitchell requested, her tone suggesting curiosity rather than investigation. "I was given a choice between resignation with honor or court-martial for operational failures that weren't my responsibility," Maria replied. "I chose to protect the mission and the people involved, even though it meant accepting blame for decisions I didn't make." Mitchell made notes in her file, her expression neutral, despite the implications of what she'd heard. Maria's case file contained enough classified information to understand the political context of her discharge, but professional ethics required her to let Maria tell her own story rather than revealing what government records already documented. "That must have been a difficult decision." "It was the right decision," Maria said firmly. "Sometimes serving your country means accepting personal sacrifice to protect larger interests. I knew what I was signing up for when I volunteered for classified assignments." Maria studied Mitchell more carefully, noting small details she'd missed initially. The slight tan line where a wedding ring had recently been removed. The calloused trigger finger that suggested regular firearms training beyond what most psychologists received. The way she positioned herself in the room, back to the wall, clear view of the door. "You were downrange," Maria said suddenly. "Afghanistan. Bagram, maybe." Mitchell's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. "What makes you say that?" "The way you sit. The way you scan the room. The tan pattern on your wrists. And that pin on your lapel, that's the 10th Mountain Division support staff." A small smile crossed Mitchell's face. "Kandahar, actually, 2012 to 2014. I worked with special operations teams after high-risk deployments." The revelation shifted the dynamic between them. Maria hadn't just identified Mitchell's military background, she'd recognized specific operational patterns that suggested shared experiences. "How did you know this room is bugged?" Maria asked quietly. Mitchell's eyebrows rose slightly. "I didn't say it was." "You didn't have to. You've been positioning your notepad to block the microphone under the desk every time we discuss anything sensitive. And you've been keeping your voice modulated at a frequency that interferes with voice recognition software." For a moment, the professional facade dropped, and Mitchell looked at Maria with genuine respect. "You haven't lost your edge. Some training never goes away." Mitchell leaned forward slightly. Romeo Echo Delta Foxtrot, Oscar X-Ray. Without hesitation, Maria responded, Sierra Tango Alpha Yankee, Sierra Hotel Alpha Romeo Papa. The exchange wasn't random letters. It was a classified authentication protocol used to verify identity between intelligence personnel. Mitchell had just confirmed she was authorized to discuss matters beyond her apparent role as psychologist, and Maria had verified her own status. Now that we understand each other, Mitchell said, her tone shifting subtly, let's talk about nightfall. At the Vasquez family auto shop, Lucia Vasquez paced anxiously between the service bays. Her sister had never failed to return from a delivery, never been unreachable by phone. Something was very wrong. Tony Vasquez, their uncle and shop owner, watched his niece with growing concern. At 62, his weathered face bore the lines of a man who'd worked with his hands his entire life. He'd raised the girls after their parents died, taught them everything he knew about cars, and respected Maria's silent strength without ever questioning the shadows behind her eyes. She's been gone 18 hours, Tio, Lucia said, running her hands through her dark hair. At 19, she was the opposite of her reserved older sister, expressive, talkative, wearing her emotions plainly. I called the hospitals. Nothing. I called the police. They said they'd look into it. Something happened to her. Tony wiped his hands on a shop rag, leaving streaks of engine grease. Your sister can take care of herself, mija. But she never disappears without saying something, and she was just delivering parts to Lakeside. A simple job. The bell over the shop door jangled, and they both turned, hoping to see Maria. Instead, they found James Rodriguez, a regular customer and Vietnam veteran, who'd taken a shine to the Vasquez family since moving to Riverdale 5 years ago. Tony, he said, his voice tight with concern. We need to talk about Maria. Tony gestured toward his office, a small room cluttered with invoices and parts catalogs. Lucia finished Mrs. Peterson's oil change. I'll handle this. Once the door closed behind them, Rodriguez spoke quickly. There's talk at the VFW. They say a Hispanic woman was detained at the checkpoint yesterday. Military background, being held by the feds. I heard the name Vasquez. Tony sank into his chair. Maria, he whispered. That's not all, Rodriguez continued, leaning forward. They're saying she was special forces or intelligence, something classified. He paused, studying Tony's face. Is it true? Was Maria? I don't know what my niece did in the army, Tony answered carefully. She never talked about it, just came home 3 years ago, said she was done with that life and asked for a job. Rodriguez nodded slowly. My son served in Iraq. When he came home, he wasn't the same. Wouldn't talk about what he'd seen. But sometimes I'd catch him looking at shadows like they might attack, checking sight lines in restaurants, positioning himself with his back to the wall. Maria does the same, Tony admitted. I never asked why. Because some questions are better left unasked, Rodriguez said quietly. But now we need to find out where they're holding her. Father Michael Ryan had served the Riverdale community for 22 years. His small parish church of St. Francis had weathered economic downturns, demographic shifts, and social changes, remaining a constant in a changing world. The Vasquez family had been parishioners since they arrived in town, though Maria attended only on major holidays, slipping in late and leaving early. That Thursday evening, the church basement was packed with nearly 200 residents. Father Ryan stood before them, his weathered hands gripping the podium as he addressed concerns that had been building throughout the week. We're here tonight because one of our neighbors was taken from us without explanation, he began, his voice carrying the moral authority of someone who'd served the community for decades. Maria Vasquez is a good woman, a hard worker, and a valued member of our township. She deserves better than federal detention without charges." The crowd represented a cross-section of Riverdale's population mechanics from the auto shop where Maria worked customers whose cars she'd repaired, neighbors who'd grown accustomed to her quiet presence in the community. They'd gathered not because they understood the complexities of her situation, but because they recognized injustice when they saw it. Lucia Vasquez sat in the front row, her college textbooks forgotten, as she struggled to comprehend how her sister's routine drive home had transformed into a federal case. At 19, she possessed the passionate idealism of someone who believed that truth and justice were synonymous, that good people were protected by systems designed to serve them. "My sister never hurt anyone," Lucia told the assembled crowd when Father Ryan invited her to speak. "She fixes cars, helps customers, pays her taxes, and minds her own business. If the government can take her away for no reason, they can take any of us." The sentiment resonated throughout the room, tapping into anxieties about government overreach that transcended political party lines. Rural communities like Riverdale maintained a complex relationship with federal authority, grateful for services and protection, but suspicious of power exercised without accountability or explanation. Reporter Carol Stevens occupied a seat near the back, her recorder capturing statements that would fuel additional news coverage of Maria's case. She'd been following the story since receiving a tip about the unusual federal detention, recognizing that it contained elements of racial profiling, government secrecy, and community impact that would resonate with readers throughout the region. "Has anyone been able to get information about why she's being held?" Stevens asked during the question period. Tony Vasquez stood to answer. "Federal agents came by the shop yesterday asking questions about her work, her customers, her habits. They wouldn't say why they were investigating, just that it involved national security." His voice took on a bitter edge. "National security for fixing transmissions." His comment drew laughter tinged with frustration from the crowd. The disconnect between Maria's mundane civilian life and federal security concerns seemed to epitomize government bureaucracy at its most absurd. How could an auto mechanic pose threats that required indefinite detention? From the back of the room, a man in his 60s stood up. Unlike most of the attendees, he wasn't a Riverdale resident. His bearing was military, his expression grim. "My name is Colonel William Harrison, retired," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "I don't know Maria Vasquez personally, but I've been following this case with interest." The room quieted immediately. Something in his tone commanded attention. "During my 30 years of service, I worked with intelligence units whose operations remain classified. I cannot and will not discuss specifics. But I will say this: sometimes the people who sacrifice the most for this country are the ones whose service can never be publicly acknowledged." He scanned the room, making eye contact with several older men who nodded slightly in recognition. "If Maria Vasquez is who I believe she might be, then her detention isn't about fixing transmissions. It's about protecting information that could get people killed if it became public. Before you condemn the government's actions, consider that there might be reasons beyond what you can see." As Harrison sat down, the mood in the room shifted. The simple narrative of unjust detention had been complicated by the possibility that Maria's military past contained secrets that legitimately required protection. Attorney Diego Morales had driven up from the county seat specifically to attend the meeting, recognizing that Maria's case involved constitutional issues that extended beyond local jurisdiction. His practice focused on civil rights law, and he'd handled enough federal cases to understand the legal complexities surrounding classified service records. "The challenge we face," Morales explained when invited to address the crowd, "is that normal legal remedies don't apply when national security is involved. The government can detain people indefinitely for security reviews without filing criminal charges or providing specific reasons for the detention. The explanation satisfied no one, least of all Lucia, who stood again to challenge the attorney's assessment. So the government can just take people and hold them forever without explanation. That doesn't sound like America to me. Morales's response was measured but honest. It sounds exactly like America, when national security agencies believe they have justification for extraordinary measures. The legal system provides very limited recourse for people caught in security reviews, especially if their backgrounds involve classified information. Judge Marilyn Foster arrived near the end of the meeting, her presence adding judicial gravitas to discussions that had been growing increasingly heated. As a former military lawyer, she understood both the community's frustration and the legal constraints that govern classified cases. I want everyone to understand that I can't discuss specifics of any ongoing federal matter, Foster announced. But I can say that Ms. Vasquez's detention appears to be administrative rather than criminal, which means different legal standards apply. What's the difference? Someone called from the crowd. Criminal detention requires probable cause and formal charges, Foster explained. Administrative detention only requires reasonable suspicion of security concerns. The standards are lower, but the purpose is different: investigation rather than punishment. The distinction provided little comfort to a community that valued practical justice over legal technicalities. Administrative detention might satisfy constitutional requirements, but it failed to address the fundamental question of whether Maria's arrest had been justified by evidence rather than prejudice. Father Ryan concluded the meeting by organizing practical support for Maria's situation. Community members volunteered to help maintain her apartment, cover her responsibilities at the auto shop, and provide emotional support for Lucia during the indefinite separation from her sister. We may not be able to change federal policy, Ryan announced, but we can demonstrate that Maria has a community that values her and wants her home. In her federal holding cell, Maria had spent hours discussing Operation Nightfall with Dr. Mitchell, speaking in the technical language of intelligence operations that few civilians would understand. They used code words, operational designations, and geographical references that were meaningful only to those with appropriate clearance. The mission parameters changed mid-operation, Maria explained, her voice low and steady. We were initially tasked with intelligence gathering only. Observe and report on the high-value target, then extract. But then new orders came down directly from CENTCOM. The mission was upgraded to capture-kill. Mitchell nodded, making careful notes. That's consistent with the file. The authorization came from civilian leadership bypassing normal chain of command. We weren't equipped for a direct action mission. We had a 4-person recon team, minimal extraction support, and intelligence that later proved to be fundamentally flawed. Maria's eyes grew distant. The target wasn't alone. What was supposed to be a small security detail turned out to be nearly 30 fighters with heavy weapons. What happened when you realized the intelligence was wrong? I called for mission abort, twice, was overruled both times by command. They had political pressure from above. Someone wanted that target eliminated regardless of operational risk. Mitchell watched her carefully. And then we proceeded as ordered. Maria's voice remained steady, but her hands tightened slightly. 2 of my team were killed in the initial approach. Captain Reyes took a round to the throat. Lieutenant Chen was hit by an RPG. We still had comms at that point. I reported casualties and requested immediate extraction. Was told to continue the mission. She paused, closing her eyes briefly. When she reopened them, they were hard as flint. I made the call to abort, regardless of orders. Extracted my remaining teammate, Private First Class Adams, who'd been severely wounded. We were 5 clicks from extraction point. Carried him on my back while evading enemy pursuit. Reached the extraction point only to find that our helicopter support had been reassigned to another operation. "You were abandoned," Mitchell said quietly. "Officially, we were tactically reallocated due to priority mission requirements," Maria corrected with bitter precision. "Unofficially, yes, we were abandoned." "How did you survive?" "Improvised. Found shelter in an abandoned structure. Treated Adams's wounds with our field kit. Maintained radio silence except for pre-arranged transmission windows. When no extraction came after 24 hours, I made the decision to move us overland to the secondary extraction point 30 clicks away." Mitchell's eyebrows rose slightly. 30 kilometers with a wounded man. "It took us 3 days. We moved only at night, avoided roads and villages, lived off emergency rations and what we could scavenge. Adams died the morning of the 3rd day. Blood loss infection. I continued to the extraction point alone, carrying his body." The clinical detachment in Maria's voice revealed more about her training than any emotional display could have. She was reporting mission details, not reliving trauma, a distinction that only someone with similar experience would recognize. "When I reached the secondary extraction point, I was taken into custody by our own forces, debriefed for 72 hours straight, then informed that the mission was being classified beyond top secret and that a review board had determined that the mission failure resulted from my decision to abort rather than proceed as ordered. Despite the faulty intelligence and inadequate mission parameters," Mitchell noted. "Correct. I was offered a choice: accept responsibility for the failure, resign with honorable discharge, and complete non-disclosure, or face court-martial for insubordination and dereliction of duty during a critical operation. And you chose resignation. The court-martial would have been public. The mission details would have been exposed. People still in the field would have been compromised. So, yes, I took the fall." Mitchell set down her pen. "Do you regret that decision?" Maria considered the question carefully. "I regret that 2 good soldiers died for bad intelligence and political expediency. I regret that their families received redacted reports about their deaths that concealed the truth. But I don't regret protecting operational security, even at personal cost." "And now you fix cars in Riverdale." A small smile touched Maria's lips. "Now I fix cars in Riverdale. Problems with clear solutions. Honest work with visible results. No one dies if I make a mistake." Mitchell nodded, understanding the appeal of mechanical simplicity after years of moral complexity. "Your psychological profile is remarkably stable, given what you've experienced. Most people who've been through similar circumstances show higher levels of PTSD, depression, or adjustment disorder." "I had good training," Maria replied simply. "And I found ways to build a life that works for me." "One last question," Mitchell said, closing her file. "If you could go back knowing everything you know now about how Operation Nightfall would unfold, about the political betrayal and the cost to your career, would you still volunteer for that mission?" Maria didn't hesitate. "Yes, because someone had to be there for those men. Someone had to bring Adams home. Someone had to make sure Chen and Reyes weren't just left in the field. If not me, then who?" Mitchell studied her for a long moment, then nodded once, apparently satisfied. "I'll be recommending your immediate release with standard monitoring protocols. You pose no security risk and have demonstrated exemplary discretion regarding classified information throughout your civilian adjustment period." As Mitchell gathered her materials to leave, Maria asked the question that had been on her mind since her arrest. "Why now? I've been living quietly for 3 years. Why did this become a federal issue? The psychologist paused at the door. That's not in my purview to discuss. But you know. Mitchell's expression revealed nothing. I'll say only this Operation Nightfall may be officially concluded, but its ripples continue to spread. You're not the only one who was touched by it. And not everyone handled the aftermath as well as you did. With that cryptic statement, she left, leaving Maria to wonder what larger forces might be at work beyond her small detention cell. Colonel Sandra Reynolds arrived that afternoon wearing civilian clothes, her military bearing unmistakable, despite the absence of uniform. She was Maria's former commanding officer, the woman who'd guided her through some of the most dangerous assignments in modern military history, and who'd been forced to process her resignation when Operation Nightfall became a political liability. Vasquez, Reynolds said simply, her voice carrying 3 years of accumulated regret and respect. Colonel, Maria replied formally, though her expression showed genuine warmth at seeing someone who'd understood the sacrifices required by classified service. They sat across from each other in the small cell, two women who'd shared experiences that couldn't be discussed with family friends or mental health professionals without security clearance. Reynolds had been present during the aftermath of Operation Nightfall, had watched as political considerations transformed heroic service into career-ending liability, and had been forced to process paperwork that sacrificed one of her best intelligence officers to protect officials whose names couldn't be connected to failed missions. "How has civilian life been treating you?" Reynolds asked. "Better than expected," Maria answered honestly. "I found work that's meaningful without being classified, built relationships that don't require security clearance, and learned to find satisfaction in accomplishments that don't appear in official records." Reynolds nodded, understanding the challenge of transitioning from work that affected international security to daily routines that seemed mundane by comparison. Military intelligence officers often struggled with civilian employment because few jobs offered the same level of purpose and immediate consequence that characterized classified operations. "Do you regret the way things ended?" Maria met her former commander's eyes with the steady gaze that had made her effective in hostile environments. "I regret that politics trumped service, but I don't regret protecting the mission and the people involved. Someone had to take responsibility, and it was better that it be someone who understood the real cost of those operations." "You saved lives with that decision," Reynolds said quietly. "More lives than you'll ever know about, because acknowledging them would compromise operations that are still ongoing." The comment carried weight that both women understood but couldn't discuss in detail. Maria's willingness to accept blame for Operation Nightfall's failure had protected not just political officials, but also intelligence methods, operational personnel, and ongoing missions that depended on secrecy for their success. Reynolds leaned forward slightly. "I need to ask you about Michael Davis." Maria's expression didn't change, but her posture shifted subtly, a tensing so slight that only someone trained to notice micro-expressions would have detected it. "Staff Sergeant Davis," she said carefully. "He was the 4th member of our team on Nightfall, stationed at the observation post monitoring communications, not directly involved in the action phase. And after the operation, we were debriefed separately. I haven't had contact with him since." Reynolds studied her former subordinate's face. "Are you certain about that?"